やれやれだぜ。
Yes, that was a JoJo's reference, and that is the one you filthy anime degenerates are gonna get. Anyway, now that that's taken care of, Astral Chain.
I was about to give up. Something deep inside, giving me all life, using it to the unknown, losing my own control. I was sacrificed for us to survive. Every drop of my blood letting go of my insanity from within.
For the uninitiated, Platinum Games have been a long-time favorite game dev studio for hardcore gamers. For the last decade, they've built a brand around fast, high-paced action, an emphasis on skill, and enough cheese and ham to open up a deli. But then Yoko Taro came in and made them get all serious and stuff with Nier Automata, with all its sophisticated themes and nuances, changing the type of game that might be expected from the studio. Which, of course, now brings us to Astral Chain, the first game developed by them since Automata. Released on the Nintendo Switch last month, Astral Chain was effectively sold as Blade Runner crossed with Evangelion through the lens of Power Rangers SPD, focusing on dual-action gameplay while you play as a futuristic anime cop. And going by critical reception, it's been a huge success for the studio. Though that's not really a surprise, it's not like Platinum have ever made a bad game before. Some are even arguing that Astral Chain is Platinum's best work yet, which, I don't know about that. I mean, it's great, but best? Though what Astral Chain definitely is a showcase of Platinum's growth over the years, taking a lot of the tellings of a classic Platinum game, such as high-paced action and stylish combat, while innovating and deviating from that style in unique ways. So, how does Astral Chain reflect on Platinum Games' last decade developing as a development studio? Well, let's dig into that. So the basic setup of Astral Chain is that in a scientifically advanced yet post-apocalyptic setting where humanity lives on a sectioned-off artificial island called the Ark, after the Earth became corrupted by red matter and an invasion of alien chimeras, you play as one of two twins who have joined Neuron, a special task force formed by the police to fight against the chimeras. Since traditional weapons like guns don't work though, Neuron scientists created the Legions, different chimeras who were captured and forced to do a Legionnaire's bidding in fighting the chimeras. Now, is it ethical to enslave these demonic entities to fight their own? Are the ethereal chains that connect them to the characters representative of the flimsy, made-up relationship between Legion and Legionnaire? Why do these Legions seem to have a unique connection to you and your sibling? I don't know, but you can color them and even pet the dog. Originally, Platinum's devs planned to make the game more centered around catching these chimeras out in the wild to use them to fight, having over 10 different ones to use, each with their own unique powers. But Nintendo, possibly concerned about their own monster capturing game being shown up, told the devs to focus on their trademark quality gameplay, and limit it to a smaller set of Legions with a wider moveset, which might have been for the better. And that brings us to the actual combat, and at first, it takes a minute to get used to, especially anyone familiar with any of Platinum's previous titles, as there's a lot of new systems going on at once, and slight differences to familiar ones, such as the dodge system being less safe compared to past games due to less invincibility frames. So you can't dodge into an attack multiple times, and counterattacks can be stopped themselves if poorly timed. In terms of game feel, Astral Chain is more sluggish and deliberate than, say, Bayonetta or Nier Automata, focusing less on buttery smooth combat in order to accommodate for specific new systems. And also pushing it any further might have caused the Switch to burst into flames. Regardless of the lack of 60 FPS though, there is a good weight and feeling to the game once you've spent a little bit of time with it and unlock certain mechanics, since the real depth of the game doesn't become apparent until the start of File 3. Which leads us to the biggest selling point of the game, the dual action combat. A unique style of gameplay that's never been attempted before, a pioneer of its genre, a true trailblazer. Okay, while there have been attempts to get this whole controlling multiple characters at once thing done before, Astral Chain was the first within this genre to truly crack that code. Not to dump on V's familiar summoning gameplay in DMC5, but this is definitely the better realized version of that style, and it all comes down to the way they control. Basically, if you were to compare playing V to conducting an orchestra, Astral Chain is a dance, where you have to lead a partner through your own movements, and occasionally throw that partner at another dancer. The way the Legion's controlled is reminiscent of how the Wonderful 101 moves when forming Unite morphs, using a secondary stick for movement aside from the main one. But where in Wonderful 101 you're working as a singular mass, the Legion is treated as an extension of the player, and the chain binding them together both controls and limits how the combat flows. Utilizing the chain, whether it's through pulling and being pulled, chaining enemies, or blocking their movements, is a major focus of the combat, where positioning means everything. As an example, in order to balance out the strength you have playing as effectively two characters, the player character isn't able to jump freely like nearly all of Platinum's previous stylish action games, thus limiting the freedom of movement the player has. However, the player can send up a Legion to distant enemies, even those up in the air, and then be pulled along with them in order to continue a combo, giving the combat a feeling of deliberateness, since every move has to be thought out, which is why it can take a while for most to warm up to the game, if at all. Unlike other games of this genre, where you focus on your one character's attacks and placement, working together with the Legions is a central part of the combat design, such as enacting sync attacks along with them, where they add a bigger impact at the end of combos if you hit the timed attack prompt. Beyond just an extra hit, these sync attacks also change properties depending on how you initiate them, whether it's through completing a full combo while using Sword, or doing a spin attack with Beast, thus giving further options on how to use them. Then there's the fact you need to balance the Legion's limiters, since they can only be summoned for so long, meaning you can't mindlessly attack with them without concern, especially since the Legion being hit by an attack causes their limiter to decrease, and if it hits 0, you're left to fight alone until it recharges, thus putting you in an incredibly vulnerable position. This applies double on the ultimate difficulty setting, where your Legion being hit also damages you, so you can't carelessly leave them out if not actively using them, really emphasizing the need to work as a team with your Legion. The limiters can be easily maintained though by both attacking enemies using your X-Baton and by doing the Zandatsu style finisher, which along with completely healing yourself also recharges the limiter. So actively using them is a must if you want to make it through the harder mob fights and difficulties. And finally, the last piece to this whole combat puzzle is the nuances to the Legions themselves, each with their own systems to work off of. At first you only have Sword and their Metal Gear Rising parries, but as the game goes on, you get Arrow's long-range shots, Beast's rideable mount, Axe's shields, and Arm's. Each Legion can then be slightly customized to optimize how they play, through assigning ability chips, which frankly only have a marginal effect on stats and aren't that noticeable for most of the game, but are good for boosting each of their individual strengths, and the Legion's skills, 2 of which can be set on each Legion. The combination of both unique skills and skills they share universally, like the auto chainbind, is where you get to really see the differences of each Legion, and plan how to optimally use them together. Beast can stun surrounding enemies, which is good for setting up combos. Sword has their own summon swords, adding in an extra layer of damage, and Arm can create a black hole that draws in enemies, thus creating a major opening for attacks on a group. One of the best skills though, that the game never properly explains, is Hit Rush, which unchains one Legion so that they can freely attack, which gives you the ability to switch over to another Legion, effectively allowing you to have 2 out at once, and giving you twice as many options during a fight depending on how you use it. At first, Astral Chain feels quite limited by its combat, but the more you dig into it, there is a lot you can do. Between your different weapons, command skills, legions, their skills, the chain mechanics, sync attacks, and how they all work together against the dozens of different enemies, it simply requires you to think more about how to execute those cool combos while understanding both the limitations and nuances of the systems. Yes, you can get away with just mashing buttons, but there is depth to be found here, even if the game systems don't exactly try to push you in that direction, which is yet another aspect of Platinum's design philosophy that we need to look at. For experienced players of this style of game, the new ranking system Astral Chain uses for combat is quite counterintuitive to the way Platinum has done these in the past, which is both for the better and for the worst. For comparison's sake, for those not entirely familiar, with Bayonetta and its sequel, if you wanted to get a pure Platinum on a chapter, effectively a perfect run, you needed to complete everything in the chapter flawlessly in a single playthrough, including the secret missions that you have to find hidden away, some of which are just frustrating to get through, even if you've done them before. This has always been somewhat of a sore spot for players, because it makes getting better results more tedious than it ideally should. On the other hand, you have Astral Chain, where getting better file/chapter grades no longer requires doing the whole level perfectly, just simply improving on the fights you did poorly on, or finding any you may have missed before. The design of this was to make it all more simple to deal with on a casual level, especially since files are much longer, which is also why you can now select specific sections of a file to start on. So if you got an A on a case that you previously got an S+ rank on, it will keep your best ranking, and the total of a file's overall rankings is based on the best you've done ever, and not on a single run, making complete 100% S+ playthroughs significantly more attainable than in the past. Then there's the specific ways that those grades are even calculated. In previous Platinum games, this was typically figured out by totaling up the amount of time a fight took, how much damage you'd taken, and the overall points earned through doing combos, dodges, and the such. It's simply the better you perform, the better grades you get. In the end, these are ultimately superfluous though, as you don't need specific grades to get through the game. This isn't grade school. These grading systems are simply a way to quantify your skills as a player and subtly push you to learn how to perform better to get better grades. Because in the end, we're all vain people that don't like being told we did poorly. With Astral Chain though, the grading was reworked on a fundamental level, resembling something closer to the system Transformers Devastation used. And for those few of you that have played it and know what I'm talking about, just know that I appreciate you. Essentially, the time and damage expectations were significantly reduced, with the grade now based more on earning points, which are built up through different conditions you meet during fights, such as only using long-range attacks, executing finishers, pulling off multiple chain binds, and how fast you defeat all the enemies. So while avoiding damage and being fast are a bonus, no longer is there an implied scoff after getting hit due to a poorly timed dodge in an otherwise flawless encounter. Using items are also no longer discouraged since you have to manage both your health and the Legion's battery power, and why not toss in some grenades and power-ups while we're at it. On a design level, Astral Chain is more focused on you utilizing the new mechanics and systems to their fullest, rather than doing it perfectly. Where Bayonetta and Metal Gear Rising's gameplay could be described as centered around efficiency, Astral Chain is about synergy. How well are you working together with your legions? Are you using sync attacks? Are you managing their limiters? Are you utilizing their full movesets? However, this design comes at the cost of feeling like these grades aren't earned through your actual skills at the game, as you can get S+ ranks by simply going through each mechanic and skill that you have one by one, just ticking all the boxes, without much actual practical mastery being demonstrated. As a test, I took the time to die and revive twice against the boss at the end of File 7, something that would barely deserve a medal or grade of any kind in previous Platinum games. I was sure I would get a C or D rank by the end of it, but because I used all my legions and their abilities, and actively implemented sync attacks and chain binds, I still got an S+ ranking, even improving on the score I got the first time I did it, which doesn't feel deserved for how poorly I performed. And that isn't even getting into how arbitrary the grading can feel with the less combat-focused minigame cases. So in the end, it's a distinction between the pragmatic design and the perfectionist design. Are you someone that has a busy 9 to 5, Karen's yelling at you to pick up the kids, and you only have so much time for yourself? Then this is probably for you. But for anyone wanting a game that will push them and expect them to rise at the challenge, this is a bit of a disappointment. I think there is a happy middle ground to be found here, but as it is, Astral Chain's grading system eases off on player performance almost to the point of redundancy. Though that didn't stop me from spending hours working towards earning perfect grades on all the cases. However, that overall playtime isn't entirely based on how many times I replayed levels, and more to how Astral Chain is by far Platinum's longest game they've ever developed, down to both the way the levels play out and their overall design. With each file outside of the introduction, you have a juxtaposition between sections doing cop work on the Ark and Legionnaire work in the Astral Plane, with the former being mostly side cases that don't have any actual effect on your style rankings at the end of files, and are more there as a way to add in some extra content, plus give some downtime between the combat. These cases can range anywhere between solving ghost mysteries to getting a kid's balloon out of a tree, which completing translates to duty points, which are tallied up at the end of files and converted into XP for leveling up your rank. So basically, the better you do as a police officer protecting and serving the city, the faster you level up and become more powerful. Though honestly, while they add some fun little moments and flesh out the police aspect of the game, the cop sections aren't the most engaging on revisiting, and don't demand a lot of replayability, especially once you've reached the level cap, which is why it's fortunate that they aren't graded, so you can skip them entirely when replaying files, which you have to do a lot of if you want to see everything that the game has to offer. Then on the flip side, you have the Legionnaire work, where you have to navigate through the Astral Plane fighting chimeras. In comparison to Platinum's more linear games, Astral Chain has the most involved and intricate level design, especially due to the seemingly contradictory nature of platforming while having no ability to jump, which can be teeth-grittingly frustrating at times when it doesn't work properly. Between running across disappearing platforms, moving platforms to get across pits, and blowing up walls, you have to properly utilize your legions to fully explore the world and find all the secrets to be found. And there's a ton. Due to the level design of the Astral Plane being an extra-dimensional LEGO set that makes missing hidden paths easy, and the progression of capturing new legions that can unlock more paths, there's a lot of reason to revisit files after you've beaten them, and not just to find incomplete cases, but because enemies in those cases can be unique to that area and can't be found anywhere else. It's not like Platinum is unfamiliar with hiding away fights and weapons through levels, but fully animated cutscenes and multi-stage mini-bosses is another thing entirely. There are dozens of unique enemy designs throughout the game, most of which many players won't even find because of how well hidden they are. One of the reasons this video took such a long time to do is that there's so much content to dig into outside of the main game, because this is a world asking to be explored. There's hundreds of different chimeras, people, and locations to record, multiple hermit hideouts where they're getting ready for their eventual uprising, a variety of vending machines with distinct personalities, an existential work bot, and over a dozen cats to save and adopt out in the wild. If you're an astute detective and paying attention, you can even unlock diary entries written by Captain Howard, the main character's adoptive father, detailing the day he found the twins and further developing the state of the world they live in. Despite having interesting world building though, like how everyone in Neuron plays along with Marie's Lappy shtick, the actual writing of the game holds it back. And yes, this is where I complain about the writing. Also, spoiler warning here because I'm going to be going into everything, so fair warning. Now, I'm aware whinging about a Platinum Games title having a poorly done story is like complaining there isn't enough water in a desert. That's not what they're about. They typically come up with a gameplay concept first and then write around that. But it's still worth being critical of because there was a lot of potential here. Like a beleaguered grade school teacher, I believe Platinum writers could do better if they only applied themselves. God, is that bringing flashbacks. And this isn't an issue of the story being, as some academics might refer to as, anime as fuck. The story was clearly written to have an anime-inspired feeling to it, down to hiring famous manga artist Masakatsu Katsuro to do all the character designs, which the developers then chose to lean into. And some of the best moments of the game are pure action anime. No, my issues are much more in its structure and execution, with the biggest one being the main character themselves. As I touched on earlier, at the start of the game, you pick and name one of two twins, and design them to be your own Tumblr OC. And while the other twin is fully voiced and has their own part in the story, whichever one you choose is kept silent for the entire game outside of a brief moment during the epilogue, which you may be forgiven for not realizing since it's such a jarring mix-up from the emotionless nothing presented the entire game. Because of the silent protagonist, every meaningful scene requires there to be at least another two characters present, because the player character isn't able to engage in any way. Look at the scene where Brenda lets you know your twin is going to be fine after being stabbed through the torso. Your character just lost their father, and now their sibling is in critical condition after saving them. This is a moment for a really emotion-driven scene. and one where a character being dead silent in thought can work. But since this is their default setting, and Olive has to be the one they're reacting to the good news, it all ends up feeling stilted. There are the tiniest hints of emotions in the character's gestures, but they're always firmly held back, because the developers don't want you to infer any actual sentiment, and would rather you project yourself onto them. And that's not my own take on it either, as the director, Takahisa Tora, told the lead animator on the project, "I want players to be able to project themselves onto the player character, so they naturally feel like part of the game. So don't give the player character any extreme expressions that might give them too much of a predefined personality." But here's the thing, you know what's better than projecting? Relating. The reason Wonder Red is one of Platinum's best written characters is because he has a genuinely endearing personality and backstory you can relate to. And that isn't even touching on how beloved Bayonetta has become largely due to her personal charm.
As long as there's music, I'll keep on dancing.
And it's not as if a player insert can't be used to make an engaging story either, but it requires giving the player the chance to make their own choices as a way to express their own character if that's what you want them to get out of it. As a direct comparison, this is why Bayleth and Fire Emblem Three Houses is so popular among players, because you can cater how you want the character to be through the decisions you make as the professor at the school and who you spend time with during the downtime. The player is able to create their own narrative due to Bayleth being a blank slate. In Astral Chain though, it's a straightforward story with little input required from the player outside of a single option in the final moments and how you choose to dress them. So a silent protagonist that's restricted from showing genuine emotion doesn't add anything, and drags down a lot of the potential pathos in scenes. Although, if you're dressed as Lappy, these cutscenes are all improved 10,000%.
As for you, you'll make a fine trial run.
Then there's the issue of the story structure itself. Looking at the storyline as a whole, there's a lack of cohesion. The story starts off being about the twins and the other members of Neuron dealing with the loss of their legions and their captain/father, who they all had a deep connection with, giving you brief vignettes showing you what he meant to them, which is resolved when it all comes together and... oh, that's all dropped as soon as the Axe Legion is captured and the rest of the squad isn't seen for the rest of the game after you get their respective legions? Oh, okay. Oh, but that's all just set up for the real story of the suppressed Sector 9 and the liberation group the Hermits, with their most villainous leader Kyle, where you have to stop them from tearing down the walls of Sector 9 and possibly wrecking Central City, with your new friend Hal having some sort of mysterious connection to it all with... oh, that also goes nowhere and Kyle's whole implied relationship with Hal isn't brought up again aside from a bit in the epilogue? Okay, well, there's Jenna Anderson and Commander Yosef's poorly defined war for evolving humanity, and the secret Sele-type cabal going on in the background, trying to create some sort of human instrumentality project to become as gods, with your eventual grassroots rebellion to stop them? Yes? Is that where we're going? Basically, there's a lot of planting but no payoff, where the story's jumping between interesting potential narrative ideas that intersect, but not really resolving them before moving on to the next. The ending of the game with Yosef's big reveal was set up quite early on. From the start, you know something's up, but it feels disconnected from the rest of the game. Characters like Kyle, Jin, and Alicia, all interesting and having their own personal motivations and backstories, are unceremoniously dropped by the second half of the game. Kyle, even within the same file he's introduced in. I expected for them to all possibly pop up at some point when your team groups up in the lower levels to fight Yosef and his team of Akira clones, maybe paying off their respective motivations that were established, like Jin promising to protect the twins in the captain's absence, but nope. Honestly, the character with the best arc and resolution is Carlos.
Choice sits ill at ease with me. Was it truly the choice most becoming of an officer of the law? Perhaps it's best if I seek a new vocation.
Separate from the shaky structure, your sibling Akira and their wavering conviction between supporting you and wanting to do what they think will save humanity from the Chimeras after the loss of their father is the main driving force of the narrative by the midpoint of the game. And there is something there, But aside from having to play off of your character's blank expressions the entire time, it's missing crucial story beats to properly flesh that out. Once you get to the end game, you have one more fight with them, but it's incredibly contrived, as it's because they need to prove they aren't one of the clones and is the original Akira. So they're gonna fight you to do so. Okay? At this point, the game wants to have a final rival fight in the penultimate moments of the story, because that's become a standard of character action games like this, and it makes their send-off in the end more bittersweet, but can't quite justify it with how it's paced out. Jetstream Sam or Jean this is not. And again, I know Platinum aren't known for telling high-concept stories unless they bring in Yoko Taro or it's a hyper-self-aware genre send-up. But because of their talent for style, they can make great sequences, namely in the way they conclude their games. So while the platforming section of the final boss is awful due to the camera, and the fact Noah Prime having instant kill attacks is annoying, the final chapter of the game is still impressive, both visually and thematically. In one of the game's more subtle moments, depending on how you choose to react to Akira telling you to end them in order to stop the Noah they've assimilated into, either your departed father's Axe Legion will join you to help you in this moment, or Akira will force their old Arrow Legion to do it if you aren't willing to. That's a powerful scene that speaks to the core of this story's focus on the twins and their complicated relationship. It's just unfortunate these moments are chained down by a story with erratic pacing, missed payoffs, characters with little personality, and oddly timed line reads.
Why didn't you tell me? I'm your brother.
Okay, I've spent a lot of time railing on the story of a game I ultimately really like. So let's end this on a positive note, and that's that the music is amazing. Platinum have always been great at creating soundtracks for their games, with Metal Gear Rising being a personal favorite to work out to. But Astral Chain may be their best yet, at least when it comes to fitting together with the game itself. To go with a futuristic setting, but stay in tune with the fast action gameplay, the composer Satoshi Igarashi, who did work on both Bayonetta 2 and Nier Automata's music, ended up blending electro, metal, and a bit of classic orchestra for the soundtrack, using the metal and electro sound for combat tracks, while focusing more on the latter during the downtime, and the orchestra during cutscenes and big story reveals. Every location in the game was designed to include both a track for when you're walking around doing investigations, and a similarly themed but more intense track to transition into once combat starts up. So, as any good soundtrack should, the music naturally flows between lower and higher intensity depending on what it's asking of the player. Tracks like Task Force Neuron have a relaxed rhythm to it that goes with the day-to-day life at the station, whereas the Astral Plane theme gives off a looming feeling of danger before layering in more electro rhythm tracks and increasing the tempo as soon as chimeras show up. Then there's the one piece outside of the anime OP intro and the end credits to include vocals, and that's the track Dark Hero, which is the theme for the Fusion Transformation. The track uses either a female or male singer based on whichever twin is picked as the playable character, which adds some extra layers to that moment and makes the sequence of fighting against your twin one of the best of the game, with lyrics about fusing with the unknown and losing all control. It's almost like giving characters a voice of some kind adds to it. One interesting detail, though, is that the music itself is played at a different pitch depending on the singer being used, as the male version is noticeably lower to go with his voice rather than having them both fit within the same range, which is smart composing. Personally, I find the female version stronger, as there's a bit too much auto-tune going on in the male singing for my taste, and it lacks the same energy, but that's just me and my correct opinions again. Overall, while I may not love everything it does or how it does it, and there is room for improvement in places, Astral Chain shows Platinum's willingness to get creative and innovate on what they're doing, and I'm all for that. Astral Chain was developed by a lot of the younger talent from the studio, with first-time art director Hajime Kimura, first-time lead composer Satoshi Igarashi, first-time lead environmental designer Noya Yokoyama, and first-time writer Akiteru Naka, all led by Takehisa Tora, the game designer behind Nier Automata in his first directorial role, which shows Platinum's ability to grow its talent. Rather than stagnating and sitting on its laurels, they're pushing to improve and develop as a studio. and as a longtime fan of theirs, I couldn't be happier about that. But seriously, where the hell is Bayonetta 3?